Why did my father look proud when the world called me a fraud? The question burned through the fluorescent silence of that courtroom. My own father, Colonel Gregory Carrington, leaned forward, his medals gleaming under the harsh lights like mock witnesses to his words. "She dishonored our family name," he said loud enough for the judge, for the cameras, for the entire country to hear. His voice didn't tremble. Mine did somewhere deep inside where no one could see it. I had faced interrogation rooms, battlefield storms, and the kind of betrayal that taught me silence could wound deeper than shrapnel. But hearing him say that was the first time I felt truly erased. When the gavel struck, the sound cracked through my chest. Reporters murmured. Camera flashes carved the air. My reflection in the polished table looked like a stranger, uniform gone, reputation shredded, the weight of a last name heavier than any rank I'd ever worn. They said I faked my entire service record, that I'd built my medals from lies. I didn't flinch when their lawyer, Simon Darden, strutted to the center of the courtroom, papers in hand like trophies of deceit. "She was forced to resign under investigation," he announced, his voice swelling with mock outrage. "A disgrace to the Navy." Behind him, my father sat stone-faced. My brother Miles, smirking, tapped his finger against the table, 3 slow beats that always meant the same thing: "You're done." Judge Harold Ellsworth raised his hand before my lawyer could even stand. His voice was calm, sharp, seasoned with something no one else seemed to notice. "Enough," he said. "I want the original file from the Department of Defense, unredacted." The gavel came down again, harder this time. The sound echoed like thunder over water. My father's jaw clenched until his knuckles went white on the armrest. Miles leaned in, whispering something that looked an awful lot like triumph. But the judge's eyes caught mine, and in that flicker of gray steel I saw it. Recognition. He'd seen that name before, Glass Dome. Outside, rain traced lines down the courthouse windows like tears the clouds were too proud to shed. My attorney, Annette Ero, caught up to me in the hallway. "You think he knows?" she whispered. I stared at the reflection of the storm and said, "If he does, then the truth just found its first witness." I didn't cry when they read the will either. 4 months before the trial, my family had gathered in an old paneled office in Alexandria. The air smelled like dust and pride, the kind that lingered for generations. My grandfather, Sterling Carrington, was gone, Chief Justice of the Virginia Supreme Court, the kind of man whose handshake used to silence rooms. Everyone assumed his estate, including the Carrington Foundation, would pass to my father. That's how the family legacy was designed, one generation of power feeding the next. When the lawyer began to read, I could feel my father's impatience vibrating through the table. But when the final line came, the words didn't land where anyone expected. "For her integrity and silent service, all holdings are to be transferred to Elizabeth Carrington." The room froze. Even the ticking clock seemed to hesitate, like time itself was stunned. My father shot up, his face darkening. "She manipulated him. She's been lying about that Navy nonsense for years." Miles leaned forward, smirking. "Don't worry, Dad, I'll fix this." I said nothing. My eyes lifted to the portrait of my grandfather on the wall, steady, kind, and still somehow watching over the battlefield unfolding below him. The lawyer handed over the document, and I saw the note written in my grandfather's hand beneath my name, to the one who served truth, even in silence. No one else understood it, but I did, because he'd been the only one who ever knew what I'd truly done. As I turned to leave, Miles brushed past me and whispered, "You won't keep this. We'll make sure of it." I met his grin with calm. "You might want to check who you're fighting against." He laughed, too sure of himself to see the storm he'd just awakened. 8 years earlier, I had walked out of that same house with nothing but a duffel bag and a conviction that silence wasn't surrender. My father didn't hug me goodbye. He just said, "Don't bring shame back to this family." I'd grown up in a home where order was love and obedience was currency, where dinner felt like inspection and affection came measured by performance. My father believed discipline was proof of devotion. He believed silence meant strength. I learned both well, but I learned something he never did. Silence can also be rebellion. When I joined the Navy, he didn't stop me, but his approval came wrapped in contempt. You'll never survive without a man's name protecting you. He was wrong. I did survive, just not in the way he'd ever understand. Years later, I was recruited into the Office of Naval Intelligence, a world without uniforms or parades, just codes, shadows, and people who vanished when their work was done. They called my mission Operation Glass Dome. Our objective: intercept and neutralize a cyber attack targeting multiple U.S. embassies across Europe. We succeeded, but success always comes with ghosts. A senior officer, Earl Bington, leaked classified intel. His mistake cost a man his life. The mission needed to stay buried, and someone had to take the fall. I signed the report myself. They called it a voluntary resignation under investigation, a phrase that meant disgrace without trial. Bington kept his rank. My father, his old comrade, stayed silent, not because he believed in justice, but because reputation was his altar. My name became his sacrifice. The day I signed that report, a general shook my hand. "History will forget you," he said, "but those you saved won't." He was right, history forgot, and my family made sure of it. Now, years later, I sat at my kitchen table, the soft blue light of my laptop painting the walls in silence. On the screen, the headline that reopened every wound. Sierra Ngton family sues daughter for fraudulent claims. "If they want truth in court," I whispered, "they'll have it." The cursor blinked like a heartbeat in the dark. They thought I was done, but I was just getting started. They said I forged my service record, but the real forgery began 8 years ago in my father's own office. The story broke on a local morning broadcast. My photo filled the screen. Fake Navy officer manipulates elderly judge. The anchor's tone was syrup over poison, calm, professional, lethal. At the Carrington dining table, my father smirked while sipping his coffee. Miles filmed a smug clip for social media. "Justice for Grandpa. The truth will come out." They'd hired Mail and Sutton, a law firm that didn't win in court. They won in headlines. Within days, my name became toxic. News outlets recycled the same photo of me in uniform, every caption twisting the knife a little deeper. Friends stopped calling. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid me. Even the mailman looked away. Annette begged me to speak publicly. "You have to defend yourself," she said. I shook my head. "They want noise, I'll give them silence. It'll echo louder." But silence didn't shield me. That night, an anonymous email arrived. "Meet me at Roaster Cafe, Arlington." I found something they forgot to delete. When I walked in, Tara Mendes was waiting, older now, eyes carrying the weight of secrets too long buried. She slid a cracked military phone across the table. Its screen flickered with a faint emblem, O&I. "They wiped the reports," she said, "but they forgot your signature key. You ordered the exfil, you saved 12 diplomats." I stared at the digital signature, mine undeniable. Tara leaned closer. "If you use this, it's a federal felony. You'll expose classified intel." I met her eyes. Then maybe truth deserves to be a crime. By the time I reached my car, another message had arrived. "That phone is government property. One move and you'll be court-martialed post-retirement. Signed, E.B. Earl Bington." The ghost still hiding behind my name. Back home, I wiped the phone clean except for one thing, the identification code proving authenticity. Then I drafted a motion to the court. Motion for subpoena, Department of Defense, original file, Operation Glass Dome. When I sealed the envelope marked top secret, a strange calm settled over me. They wanted a war. They just got one, in my language. I once thought war happened far from home, but that night, I realized it could begin across a dinner table, or inside a courtroom, or in the quiet between two people who once shared a last name. And as the rain tapped against my window, I whispered the promise that would carry me through everything that followed. You called me a fraud, I'll make truth your verdict. Why did Eli hesitate before he said my father's name? It was the pause, half a second too long, that told me everything. I'd called Eli Ward using an encrypted line we hadn't spoken on in years. He'd been my contact at the Pentagon during Glass Dome, a quiet genius with clearance levels most people couldn't pronounce. When his voice came through, it was lower than I remembered, rougher. There's an unedited record of Glass Dome, he said, locked under DNI authorization. Someone tampered with it. I took a breath. Who? He hesitated. I could hear him scrolling through something, maybe a file he wasn't supposed to open. Then came the sigh. The request came from Earl Bington. My pulse steadied instead of rising. Under whose approval? Another pause. When he finally answered, it was barely a whisper. Your father's signature is on the chain. For a long moment I didn't speak. I just listened to the static, the faint hum of betrayal vibrating through the line. My father had always told me that truth was loyalty. That family came before everything. But now the truth was his crime and I was its witness. Thank you, Eli, I said quietly, for telling me what no one else would. Liz, he said, his voice suddenly urgent, you know they'll come after you for this. If that file surfaces, it doesn't just end Bington, it burns your entire family name. I know. You sure that's what you want? I closed my eyes. Want wasn't the word, it was what had to be done. I'm not after revenge, Eli, I said. I'm after air. The line went dead. Across town, my father sat in his study surrounded by plaques and shadows. The news coverage flickered across his TV, my name scrolling in bold letters beneath the words alleged fraud. Miles paced behind him like a loyal echo. If we lose this, my father muttered, it's not just her who's ruined, it's me. He wasn't wrong. My disgrace had always been his armor, my silence his protection, and now that silence had found a voice. Annette and I spent that night in her law office, bathed in the sterile glow of fluorescent lights. She'd taken off her blazer hours ago, her sleeves rolled up, hair in a messy bun that said exhaustion was becoming a habit. We're not building a defense, I told her. We're laying a trap. She raised an eyebrow. What kind? The kind they can't escape from without confessing. I slid a document toward her, the motion Eli helped me craft. It demanded the Department of Defense submit the unredacted Glass Dome file directly to the judge for eyes only. A legal strike so precise, even the Pentagon couldn't sidestep it. Annette read it twice, her eyes narrowing. If this works. When it works, I corrected softly, they'll have to face the truth in their own language, classified, stamped, undeniable. She nodded slowly, and if it does, then I lose everything they already took. That night when I got home, my phone rang. Caller ID, Gregory Carrington. I almost didn't answer, but something in me, maybe the last remnant of the daughter who once tried to earn his approval, pressed accept. You're playing with fire, he said, no greeting, no hesitation. You'll burn this family down. It's already on fire, I whispered. I'm just showing the flames. He didn't respond. For the first time, the silence between us wasn't power, it was fear. Later, I learned he called Bington right after. If that file's unsealed, Bington told him, we both go down, handle your daughter. And my father's reply came through on the wiretap Annette later pulled. His voice cracked just once. She's not my daughter anymore. That was the last time I heard him sound human. Before dawn, I printed an internal memo addressed to the Department of Justice, for judges' eyes only. Case Sager 44229, Carrington v. Carrington. I stamped it confidential, Pentagon approved, and sent it through the encrypted courier network Eli had helped me access years ago. Somewhere in that same hour, Judge Harold Ellsworth opened a sealed packet on his desk. He froze at the line written years ago, Operation Glass Dome, authorized by Commander E. Carrington. His hands trembled slightly as the name resurfaced, a ghost from his own past. He remembered. He'd been the JAG officer who reviewed our debrief files after the mission. He'd signed the approval for my commendation, the one that was later erased. At that exact moment, miles away, my father dropped an old photograph into the fireplace, a picture of us both in uniform, standing on the steps of Naval Command. The edges curled, the image darkened. From now on, there was no family, only the truth. I once commanded a team that never left a comrade behind, but my own family left me the moment I stopped being convenient. Annette told me we needed a witness, someone who'd been there, someone who could verify that the mission was real, that I hadn't forged the impossible. "There's one name," I said, Senior Chief Nora Vasquez. She'd been my signals analyst during Glass Dome. If anyone knew what happened that night, it was her. We met by the Norfolk docks, the air sharp with salt and diesel, the bay rolling gray under the winter sky. Nora's hair was shorter now, streaked with silver, her eyes tired but still carrying that same fierce loyalty I remembered. "You shouldn't have called me," she said quietly. "They still monitor anyone connected to Dome." I didn't have a choice. She looked at me for a long time, then exhaled. "You took the fall so 12 people could go home. I'll stand for that." Her voice trembled not from fear but from remembering. "You know this could still be classified, right? If we testify, we risk everything." "If silence was duty," I said softly, "then truth is duty now." She nodded once, "Then I'll be there." That night, Miles came to her. He didn't know I knew, but Nora recorded the whole thing. He handed her an envelope full of cash. "Say she lied, say she forged it, you'll never have to work again." Nora's voice stayed steady. "Your father's the one who forged the documents, isn't he?" Miles hissed. "Dad said if the truth gets out, we all burn." She sent me the recording before dawn. I played it once, just once. The tremor in his voice echoed through my office. Annette wanted to file it immediately. "This ends the case," she said. "We have them on tape admitting the cover-up." "Not yet," I said. "They need exposure, not escape." I'd learned something in intelligence work. The truth isn't enough. You have to show the lie collapsing on its own. "Tomorrow," I texted Nora, "testify, just tell the truth." Across the city, my father's voice cracked again as he called Bington. "She's bringing witnesses." "Then we bring something bigger," Bington replied. "The press." The war wasn't over. It was only changing terrain. Some battles aren't won by bullets. They're won when the enemy walks straight into your silence. The morning of the testimony, the courtroom felt like a war zone without sound. Reporters packed every inch of the gallery. I could feel their hunger, the way people crave spectacle more than truth. Nora walked in with her head high. The bailiff swore her in. Her voice was steady. "Every one of us came home," she said. Simon Darden rose with a grin, waving a sheet of paper. "Your Honor, this is the official Navy record. Commander Carrington resigned under investigation. Dishonorable." He turned toward me, ready to deliver the final blow. I stood. "If that's my record," I said quietly, "I request the truth to speak for itself. Motion to declassify Section 7, Glass Dome Directive." The judge hesitated long enough for the entire courtroom to feel the shift in the air. Then, finally, he nodded. "Motion granted. The Pentagon has 48 hours." Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters nearly tripped over themselves to get to the hallway. By nightfall, headlines were everywhere. "Court RQSTS Pentagon FILES. CARRINGTON case ERUPTS." That night Bington called me. His voice was cold, calculated. You think the Navy will save you. I wrote those reports. I didn't let him finish. Ghosts haunt the guilty, I said and hung up. Moments later, an email arrived. Department of Defense file received, top secret level 5. I exhaled, the words slipping out like a vow, and now the trap is closed. 2 days later, Judge Ellsworth broke the seal on the folder. His face changed before he even turned the second page. His lips parted slightly. His eyes softened, the recognition cutting through the years. He looked at me across the room. Commander Carrington, he said slowly, Operation Glass Dome. I reviewed this mission when I was JAG. You saved 12 diplomats that day. Every sound vanished. And then, in one deliberate motion, he stood. He raised his hand in a formal salute. On behalf of those who lived because of you, he said, voice trembling, I salute you. My father's face drained of color. He rose halfway, shaking his head. That's impossible, she was. No, Colonel, the judge cut him off. She was protecting you. The gavel came down like thunder. Case dismissed with prejudice. The air in that room broke open, gasps, flashes, murmurs blending into something almost holy. Outside, the reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward. I said only one line. Truth doesn't shout, it stands. The headlines roared louder than any defense ever could. Judge salutes defendant. Navy CONFIRMS heroic operation. Inside my chest, the storm finally quieted. The courtroom had given me justice. What came next would give me peace. What does silence sound like when justice finally speaks? For years, I'd imagined this moment, how it would feel to stand in that courtroom and watch the truth unravel in front of everyone who once doubted me. But when it actually happened, it wasn't thunder or triumph that filled me. It was quiet, a strange, fragile quiet that felt almost sacred. Reporters shouted my name as I stepped out of the courthouse, cameras flashing like gunfire. I didn't stop, didn't wave, didn't try to look strong. I just walked, slow and steady, through the noise. Because after everything, silence was the loudest weapon I had left. Behind me, the words still echoed. On behalf of those who lived because of you, I salute you. That single sentence had rewritten years of shame in one heartbeat. But the truth doesn't heal overnight. It doesn't erase the scars. It just makes them easier to live with. The next morning, the world woke up different. Headlines burned through every channel. Navy confirms heroic Operation Glass Dome. Judge salutes accused veteran in historic courtroom moment. Carrington family scandal rocks Washington elite. Every journalist who once called me a fraud now wanted an interview. Every outlet that ignored my silence now begged for a soundbite, but I gave them nothing. Annette's phone didn't stop ringing. She paced the length of her office, half overjoyed, half in disbelief. Liz, this is it. You've cleared your name. The Navy confirmed your record. Bington's done. Your father's being investigated. You won. I looked out the window, watching the city move beneath a winter sky. No, Annette, I didn't win. Truth did. She stopped. You don't sound relieved. I turned to her slowly. Relief isn't what comes after a war. Survival is. She nodded quietly, understanding more than she said. By afternoon, the Department of Defense released an official statement confirming that Operation Glass Dome was real, and that my resignation had been falsely classified due to internal misconduct. They named the two men responsible, Admiral Earl Bington and Colonel Gregory Carrington. I thought that would be enough. It was. Because justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't end a story. It just changes its shape. Bington was suspended indefinitely pending investigation. My father was stripped of his advisory position at the Carrington Foundation. His public image, once flawless, fractured overnight. And yet I didn't feel joy watching it happen. Only an ache deep in my chest, the kind that comes when you see the ruin of something that once held meaning. That night I returned home and found a figure waiting outside my apartment. A man in civilian clothes, posture still military even in the cold. Eli Ward. He handed me a sealed envelope. "Official copy," he said. "The unredacted glass dome file. It's yours now." I took it, my fingers brushing his. "You didn't have to risk this." He smiled faintly. "You think I could live with myself if I did?" We stood there in silence for a moment, the wind carrying the city's hum around us. "You know," he said softly, "most people spend their lives trying to prove who they are. You just proved who they are." I didn't reply, I just nodded, because I wasn't done yet. Inside the envelope was everything I'd fought for, the truth in ink and code. But tucked near the bottom was a name I hadn't expected. Judge Harold Ellsworth, JAG Review Officer, 2013. He'd been the one who cleared our mission a decade ago. And now, years later, he'd been the one to stand for it. Sometimes the world comes full circle. Sometimes justice takes the long way home. The next morning, my father appeared at my office. No warning, no appointment. Just a man who looked like a ghost wearing my family's face. He'd aged 10 years in 2 days. His hair was thinner, his posture less certain. But his eyes, those same cold, commanding eyes, still searched for control. "I brought something," he said quietly, holding out a yellowed envelope. I didn't move to take it. "You could have sent it. I owed you this in person." He placed it on my desk and stepped back as if even proximity to me burned. "He wrote this for you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Your grandfather, I never gave it." He turned to leave, but something in me, something old and unfinished, spoke. "Why now?" He stopped at the door. "Because I thought I understood honor," he said, "and I didn't." He left before I could answer. When I opened the envelope, I found only a single line written in my grandfather's familiar hand. "Honor isn't loud, it's patient." For a long time I just stared at it. Those words had been my compass once. Now they were my proof that silence wasn't weakness. It was strength waiting for the right moment to speak. I folded the letter gently and placed it beside my grandfather's photograph on the shelf. Then I sat down and let the weight of it all sink in. I had my name back, my honor, the truth. But beneath it all there was still the ache of everything I'd lost to get here, the years of distance, the love that had turned into suspicion, the family that became an enemy. Justice had cleared me, but it couldn't give me back the version of myself that once believed in them. That night I sat alone by the window watching headlights drift through rain. My phone buzzed, another message from the press. "Exclusive interview offer, CNN Prime Hour." I deleted it. Then another, 60 Minutes requests official statement. Delete. And finally one from Annette. "You could change lives if you speak, Liz. Think about it." I typed 3 words and hit send. "I already am." Because truth doesn't always need an audience. Sometimes it just needs a direction. Weeks passed. The Carrington Foundation fell under review and board members resigned one by one. In their absence, the court transferred control back to me, the rightful heir named in my grandfather's will. The day I walked back into that building, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like coming home to a house that still smelled of smoke. Every wall still carried his portrait, every hallway his legacy. But now, for the first time, I could breathe there. I gathered the board that remained, people who had once looked at me with doubt, now unable to meet my eyes. "The foundation will continue," I said calmly, "but not as a monument to our name, as a service to those who were silenced like I was." They nodded, some ashamed, others relieved. I continued. "We'll rename the Veteran Outreach Program. It'll be called Valor in Silence." A few of them exchanged glances. One woman, an older trustee, spoke softly. "For the ones who never got credit." I smiled faintly. "Exactly." From that day, the Carrington Foundation began to rebuild. Slowly, honestly. We funded therapy and housing for female veterans. We helped clear the names of those falsely accused. We supported families of agents who never came home. Nora Vasquez became the executive director. Eli Ward joined as a cybersecurity consultant, creating systems to protect classified identities from corruption, the very thing that once destroyed mine. And I stayed behind the scenes. No speeches, no interviews, just quiet work. On my desk sat three things: the Navy Cross they returned to me, the yellowed letter from my grandfather, and a small photo of the 12 diplomats saved under Glass Dome. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch myself whispering their names, as if keeping them alive through sound. A year passed. The city moved on, as cities do. But sometimes, the wind still carried whispers of that courtroom day. Then one morning a letter arrived, handwritten, no return address. The handwriting was unmistakable, my father's. I thought honor was visible. It read, "You proved it's something to be kept. I'm proud of you, even if I'm not worthy to say it." No signature, no apology, just that. I folded it gently and placed it beside my grandfather. 2 generations, one who taught me what honor meant, one who finally learned it too late. That evening I stood on the balcony overlooking Arlington. The sun dipped low, turning the sky to gold and shadow. Below, flags rippled in the fading light, hundreds of them, each marking a story that ended too soon. I rested my hands on the railing and let the wind move through my hair. "They called me a fraud," I whispered, "but truth doesn't beg to be believed, it just waits to be seen." Behind me, the old letter on my desk fluttered open, the ink shimmering in the last light of day. Honor isn't loud, it's patient. I closed my eyes. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't hurt, it healed. Because dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. When the war ends, what do you do with the silence it leaves behind? That was the question that haunted me in the months after the verdict. For years, I'd lived like every second was a battle, every breath an act of defiance. But when the war stopped, when the shouting and the headlines and the courtroom chaos finally went quiet, I didn't know how to live without the noise. Peace, I realized, isn't the absence of conflict. It's the space where you start learning to breathe again. The Carrington Foundation became my new mission, my battlefield of redemption. I poured everything I had into rebuilding it from the ashes of my family's pride. We renamed our flagship program Valor in Silence. It wasn't just a title. It was a promise to give a voice to those who'd been buried under bureaucracy, betrayal, or the kind of silence that once nearly destroyed me. Nora Vasquez ran the program like she'd been waiting her whole life for it. She knew the pain of being erased, the quiet humiliation of watching truth dissolve under red tape. She carried the empathy I'd lost somewhere between operations and courtrooms. Together, we built something real. We started small, funding therapy sessions for female veterans denied medical benefits because of misconduct that never happened. We paid for legal teams to reopen cases for those forced to resign under investigation. Every file felt like a ghost set free. Every story was another wound I recognized. But rebuilding the foundation wasn't just about them. It was about facing the one person I'd spent years avoiding, myself. One night, months after the verdict, I found myself sitting alone in the boardroom. The building was empty, the city lights painting reflections across the glass table. On the wall behind me hung my grandfather's portrait, the one with his calm, measured eyes. I looked up at him and whispered, "Did I do it right?" Of course, he didn't answer, but somehow the silence felt approving. There was something almost poetic about the irony, how the same walls that once echoed with my father's pride now held meetings about compassion, how the same name that once stood for arrogance now stood for service. Still, the ghosts didn't vanish. Sometimes I dream of the courtroom, of the gavel, of the moment Ellsworth's voice trembled with honor. Sometimes I'd wake up to the sound of rain and think it was the thunder of applause I never asked for. And sometimes, when I least expected it, I'd feel the ache of memory. The child who once wanted her father's approval, the officer who wanted to belong, the woman who learned that silence could both save and scar her. One morning I found an envelope waiting on my desk. No name, no seal, just a folded piece of paper with a single line written in neat, careful handwriting. You showed me that truth can survive even when love doesn't. I didn't need a signature to know who it was from. Miles. He'd vanished after the trial, no statements, no contact, no defense. But this letter, it wasn't an apology. It was something else. A surrender, maybe, or an understanding he never could have reached when pride was louder than conscience. I folded the paper and placed it next to my father's letter. 3 generations of Carringtons, each learning in their own way that silence carries more truth than words ever could. That afternoon, Nora walked in holding a file. "We've got another case," she said. "Lieutenant Sasha Quinn, honorably discharged on paper, blacklisted in reality. They buried her record for whistleblowing." I took the file and skimmed the pages. Another name, another silence. "Where is she now?" "Virginia Beach, working night shifts at a bar." "Bring her in." When Sasha arrived a week later, she looked like I used to, tired, guarded, wearing the kind of strength that's learned the hard way. She sat across from me, her hands clasped tight. "You don't know what they'll do if this gets out," she said. I smiled faintly. "I know exactly what they'll do." She studied me for a moment. "You really think truth changes anything?" I leaned forward. "It doesn't change them, it changes you." Her eyes softened just enough for hope to slip through. And in that moment, I saw a reflection of myself, years ago, when I still thought silence meant defeat. After she left, I walked down to the Foundation's Memorial Hall. The walls were lined with plaques, names of those we'd helped clear, their records restored. Above the entrance hung one phrase carved in steel: "For those who were silenced, and those who refused to stay that way." Sometimes I just stand there and read the names, not to remember the battles they fought, but the peace they earned. Weeks later, the Department of Defense sent a formal invitation. I'd been nominated for the Navy Cross reinstatement ceremony, a public acknowledgement of the honor that had once been stripped from me. For a moment I considered refusing. I didn't need the medal, I already had what mattered. But then I thought of the women who sat in my office every week, those who needed to see that silence could win. That endurance had a face. So I said yes. The ceremony was held in D.C., under a sky so clear it almost felt wrong. Rows of uniforms, the smell of polished brass, the steady hum of precision and pride. When they called my name, Commander Elizabeth Carrington, I walked forward slowly. Not with arrogance, not with revenge, but with the kind of calm that comes from surviving something bigger than yourself. The medal was cool against my chest. The general's voice rang clear as he pinned it. "For valor in service, for sacrifice without recognition, and for choosing truth over comfort." I saluted, the cameras flashed, and for once I didn't feel like they were taking something, they were giving it back. Afterward, Judge Ellsworth approached. No robe now, just an old man in a simple suit. His handshake was warm. "You reminded me," he said, "why I joined the law in the first place." I smiled. "You reminded me why silence matters." He chuckled softly. "You think you'll ever forgive your father?" I paused, looking past him at the sea of flags waving outside the window. "I already did, but forgiveness doesn't mean return, it means release." He nodded. "Then you've done more than most." That night back at my office, I placed the medal beside my grandfather's letter. I didn't hang it on the wall. I didn't display it in glass. I left it where I could see it every morning and remind myself that sometimes the quietest victories are the loudest truths. But the story didn't end there. Months later, I received a call from the Department of Veterans Affairs. They wanted me to consult on a new initiative, training programs for female operatives re-entering civilian life. I hesitated. You sure you want someone like me on your list? The voice on the other end laughed. Ma'am, you're the reason the list exists. So I said yes again. That's how it started. A new mission, a new form of service. I spent weeks traveling between bases, speaking to women who'd been forgotten, silenced, or buried in bureaucracy. Each story hit the same chord. They weren't looking for sympathy. They were looking for acknowledgement. One of them, a young intelligence analyst named Aaron, said something that stuck with me. You think courage is loud, she said, but it's really just quiet persistence. She was right. Every day after that, I carried those words with me like armor. The world still whispered my name sometimes, Carrington, the woman the judge saluted. But I never answered to the story they told. I answered to the truth I lived. Late one evening, as the foundation closed, Nora came into my office. She held a folder, but her expression was softer than usual. You ever think about what's next? She asked. I leaned back. Next. Yeah, you've rebuilt everything. You've proven everything. Maybe it's time to rest. I smiled faintly. Rest isn't in my vocabulary. She laughed. That's what I thought. But as she left, her words lingered. Maybe rest didn't mean stopping. Maybe it meant peace. That night I stood again on my balcony, the wind cool against my face, the city glowing beneath me. In the distance, I could hear faint echoes from Arlington, trumpets, ceremony, remembrance. And I thought of every battle that had brought me here, every silence I'd survived, every truth I'd refused to bury. They called me a fraud. They tried to break my voice. But I learned that truth doesn't shout, it waits. And when it finally speaks, it doesn't ask permission. It simply stands. How do you rebuild a life when the world finally believes you? That question came to me one morning while I was standing in front of the mirror, half-dressed for another day at the foundation. The woman looking back wasn't the same person who'd faced that courtroom. Her hair was shorter now, her face a little older, the edges of her expression calmer, her eyes softer, like someone who'd stopped waiting for permission to exist. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up to dread. I woke up to purpose. But peace, I discovered, isn't a finish line. It's a rhythm you learn to keep. Most people assume that after the trial my life went back to normal. They thought vindication erased pain. It doesn't. It just gives you space to carry it differently. At the foundation, work became my new uniform. It grounded me. It gave me structure when my heart still carried too much noise. Nora handled most of the public side, press briefings, veteran ceremonies, partnerships. I stayed in the background, running operations, quietly shaping systems that could outlast people. One morning, she burst into my office holding a tablet. Liz, you need to see this. On the screen was a news clip. Admiral Earl Bington formally indicted. The anchor's tone was sharp, rehearsed. Evidence from the Carrington trial has led to charges of falsifying military records, obstruction of justice, and perjury. Sources confirm additional classified investigations are underway. I watched it once, expressionless. Then I set the tablet down. Nora studied me. Aren't you going to say anything? I exhaled slowly. What is there to say? Justice already spoke. She smiled softly. You're not curious what happens to him. No, I said, because it's not about what happens to him. It's about what happens to the people like us when truth finally wins. She nodded and left the room quietly. After she was gone, I stared out the window at the morning light washing over D.C. for years. I had chased the truth as if it were something external, something buried in files or courtrooms or other people's approval. But now I knew. The truth had always been inside me. I just needed to stop defending it to everyone else. That evening, as I locked the office, I found a message waiting on my desk. A single envelope, unmarked. Inside was a photo, old, faded. It was taken years ago during Glass Dome. 12 of us crammed into a dim briefing room, exhaustion and relief written all over our faces. On the back, someone had scrawled a few words. "You kept us alive, we never forgot." No name, no address, just that. I sat down and held it for a long time. It wasn't the medal. It wasn't the verdict. It was this proof that the lives I'd saved remembered, even if history didn't. That night I couldn't sleep, so I went walking through the city, down the quiet streets near the river where the noise of the world faded into water. Every streetlight shimmered like memory. Every shadow felt like a ghost finally at peace. When I reached the memorial wall across from the reflecting pool, I stopped. Dozens of names. Men and women who had served in silence, who had disappeared into classified missions, never to be spoken of again. No parades, no ceremonies, just carved letters under glass. I pressed my hand against the cool surface and whispered, "I carried your silence as my own. You can rest now." A voice came from behind me. "You always talk to ghosts, Commander." I turned. Eli Ward stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, a faint smile under the streetlight. "Only the ones who listen," I said. He stepped closer, his face half lit, half shadow. "They're starting a task force," he said quietly. "Internal security for covert ops. They want you to lead it." I shook my head. "I'm done with wars." "This isn't war," he said. "It's prevention. It's what you always wanted, to make sure what happened to you never happens again." I studied him for a long time. "You think they'd really let someone like me lead it?" He smiled. "They don't have a choice anymore." I laughed softly, the sound almost foreign in my mouth. "You always know how to make trouble sound noble." "Maybe because I learned it from you." There was a pause between us, comfortable, unhurried. Then he said, "You should consider it. The country still needs people who fight quietly." I looked back at the memorial. "So do I." He left me there, standing under the stars, thinking about the kind of peace that doesn't mean stopping, but transforming. The next day, I met with the board. "I'm stepping back from daily operations," I told them. "Nora will take over full management. I'll stay on as chair." They looked surprised. "Are you leaving?" someone asked. "No," I said, "I'm expanding." And I meant it. A month later, the task force became official, the Integrity Initiative. Its mission was simple but powerful: review and protect the classified service records of operatives working under anonymity, to ensure no one could ever be erased the way I was. When the director handed me the official badge, I felt the weight of it, not as power but as responsibility. I wasn't coming back to the system to serve them. I was coming back to guard the truth from them. Eli joined as deputy liaison. Our first assignment was simple on paper but complex in heart, auditing the service histories of covert personnel flagged for inconsistencies. Buried beneath those files were lives, people punished for loyalty, silenced for honesty. Each one was a mirror. One case in particular stayed with me. Captain Jenna Lee, court-martialed for insubordination after exposing a weapons misappropriation scheme. Her record redacted, her name smeared. When we opened her file, the evidence was clear. She'd told the truth, and they destroyed her for it. I reached out to her personally. We met at a small cafe near Langley. She looked up when I walked in, surprise flickering in her eyes. "You're her," she said, "the one the judge saluted." I smiled faintly. "That's one way to put it." She laughed quietly, though it sounded more like disbelief. "I used to think stories like yours were made up." "So did I said. We talked for hours, about service, silence, survival, about what it means to love a country that sometimes forgets you exist. Before she left, she asked, "Do you ever stop fighting?" I thought about that for a long moment. "No," I said finally, "but you learn to fight differently." She nodded. "Then maybe there's hope." After she left, I sat there watching the sun melt into the Potomac. hope. The word felt lighter than it used to, less like a wish, more like a decision. That night back at my apartment, I found myself standing on the balcony again, the city humming beneath me. From here, life looked almost peaceful, streets glowing, people moving, stories unfolding quietly in windows. I thought about my father then, where he might be, what he might be thinking. The last I'd heard, he'd moved to a small coastal town in Maine, retired, alone, away from the eyes of the world he once needed to impress. Sometimes I wondered if he ever stood by the ocean, thinking of the daughter who'd become the mirror of his mistakes. Sometimes I hoped he did. I never called him, never wrote, but forgiveness isn't measured by contact, it's measured by peace. Weeks later, I received a small package with no return address. Inside was an old silver insignia, the one he'd worn during his command years. There was a note attached, written in his uneven hand. For the one who kept her oath when I forgot mine. No signature, no apology, just that. And that was enough. I placed it beside the others, the letters, the photo, the medal, the silence, and realized something. My life had become a collage of quiet truths. Every object in that collection was a story no one could rewrite again. Years ago, I had begged for the world to see me. Now, I wanted nothing more than to keep my work unseen, quiet, effective. There's freedom in not needing to be known. And yet sometimes, when I walked through the foundation lobby and saw the young veterans waiting for help, the ones who didn't yet know how strong they were, I saw pieces of myself in all of them. The broken, the brave, the silenced. They were the reason I kept going. One evening, as the sun sank low, Nora came into my office holding a report. "You've read this one, right?" she asked. I glanced at the cover. Integrity Initiative, Year 1 Impact Review. "Almost," I said. She sat across from me, studying my face. "You know, Liz, people still tell your story out there. They say you're the reason women like me stayed in uniform." I looked up. That story isn't mine anymore. It belongs to everyone who refuses to disappear. Nora smiled. "Still, it started with you." Maybe it did, but I'd stopped being the center of it long ago. That was the point. Legacy isn't what stays behind when you're gone, it's what keeps going when you're silent. Later that night, I closed my laptop and stepped outside again. The wind carried the faint hum of the city, the kind of sound that feels alive and eternal. Below, the Potomac shimmered like memory, restless, relentless, reflecting every light but keeping none. I whispered to the air, "They called me a fraud, but the truth, it was never mine alone to keep." I thought of my grandfather's words, still framed on my desk. "Honor isn't loud, it's patient." And I realized he'd been right all along. Patience isn't waiting for justice, it's carrying faith through silence until it arrives. That's what I'd done. That's what I'd become. The woman they branded a liar had become a keeper of truth. Not by shouting, not by proving, but by standing. And as the night deepened around me, I smiled, for the first time in years, not because I'd survived the war, but because I finally understood why I had to fight it. How do you keep the truth alive in a system built to bury it? That was the question that followed me long after the cameras stopped showing up, long after the headlines faded, long after the world moved on. The Integrity Initiative had become something larger than I'd ever intended, part reform, part rebellion, hidden in plain sight within the very machine that once destroyed me. We were supposed to be protecting records, auditing operations, preventing corruption. But what we were really doing was something far more dangerous. We were pulling on threads the system didn't want unraveled. I learned that the hard way. It started with a file, a simple request for review. Case 7714B, operative, Harper Dunn. She'd been part of a covert recon team in Eastern Europe, discharged for insubordination after refusing to falsify intel on a civilian strike. Her record had been wiped, her pension revoked. On paper, it was just another injustice, but buried in the metadata was something that made my blood run cold, an authorization chain identical to the one that forged my own discharge years ago. Same clearance codes, same encryption keys, same signature pattern EB. Earl Bington. He was supposed to be gone, indicted, disgraced, done. Yet here he was, hidden in digital ghosts, rewriting history from behind firewalls. I called Eli the moment I saw it. "He's still in the system," I said. "Impossible," he replied. "He's locked out of federal servers pending trial." I sent him the file, then explained this. There was silence on the line, the kind that always meant he was looking at something he wished he hadn't. "Where did you get this?" he asked finally. "It came through official review channels. Someone submitted it to test me." "You think it's bait?" I paused. "No, I think it's a message." That night I stayed at the office long after everyone left. The screens hummed softly in the dark, lines of code flickering like ghosts breathing through wires. Every digital footprint told a story, but this one felt personal, because whoever had left that trail knew I'd find it. At midnight, I decrypted the final layer of the file. It opened to a single line of text. "You can't protect truth without becoming its prisoner." No signature, no traceable origin, but I knew that kind of arrogance. I'd heard it in his voice before. Bington wasn't trying to return. He was trying to remind me that I could never really leave. The next morning, I called a meeting with Nora and Eli. She looked at the projection of the data on the wall, arms folded, jaw tight. "He's taunting you." "He's warning me," I said, "which means he's close enough to watch." Eli rubbed his temples. "If this is what I think it is, then someone high up is still protecting him. Nobody accesses those servers without authorization." "Then we find out who signed the access," I said. We traced it for days through outdated archives, dormant proxies, forgotten clearances. And when we finally found the name behind the access, I felt my chest tighten. It wasn't Bington. It was Miles. My brother. The one who'd once whispered threats in my ear, with the confidence of a man who thought legacy was a weapon. Now he'd found a new one. Nora stared at the screen in disbelief. "Your own brother reopened the chain." I nodded slowly. He must have found access through the Foundation's archives. Dad left him more than letters, apparently. Eli cursed under his breath. If he's feeding data to Bington, that's espionage. I didn't respond. I couldn't, because beneath the anger was something deeper: sorrow, the kind that comes when betrayal stops surprising you but still manages to hurt. I leaned back, closing my eyes. He's not doing it for Bington. He's doing it for revenge. Nora frowned. Revenge for what? For losing what he thought was his birthright. That night I drove to Alexandria, to the house I hadn't seen in years, the Carrington estate, now quiet, stripped of its grandeur, windows dark like blind eyes. I parked at the edge of the long driveway and sat in silence, staring at the place that had shaped everything I both hated and became. I didn't knock. I knew Miles wouldn't open the door anyway. Instead, I left a single envelope in the mailbox, a copy of the file, annotated in my handwriting. "I know what you're doing. Stop before truth burns you too." No threats, no pleas, just warning. 2 days later, Eli called. "You're not going to like this," he said. He sent me a clip, leaked footage from a private security feed. Miles entering a data center under an assumed name. He wasn't alone. Beside him, unmistakable even through the grainy image, was Bington. Still alive, still operating, still untouchable. "This isn't over," I whispered. Eli's voice came through low. "Liz, if you go after them without clearance, they'll call it vigilantism." I looked out the window at the Capitol glowing in the distance. They called me worse. He sighed. You always do this. Do what? Fight the right war the wrong way. Maybe he was right, but sometimes the only right way is the one nobody else has the courage to take. That night I reopened an old encrypted drive I hadn't touched since my Navy days. Inside were fragments of glass dome data, contingency codes, emergency trace protocols, black site locators. It was dangerous even to possess them, but they were the only map I had left to find him. Nora tried to stop me. Liz, this isn't your mission anymore. You built something good. Don't tear it down for ghosts. I looked at her steady. He's not a ghost until he's gone. For the next 2 weeks, I hunted through the digital shadows, tracing encrypted relays through outdated Navy networks, abandoned servers, even cold storage archives from intelligence agencies that didn't officially exist. Each breadcrumb led closer to one truth. Bington had built a backdoor into every system he'd ever touched, including mine. He wasn't hacking me. He was reminding me I could still be erased. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. I was leaving the Foundation late one evening when I noticed the car parked across the street. Same one every night that week. No plates, no lights, just there, watching. I approached it slowly, hand steady, voice calm. You can tell him I'm not hiding, I said aloud to the tinted window. For a moment, nothing. Then the engine started and the car drove away. Inside, on my desk, I found a single envelope waiting, no postage, no handwriting, just the same phrase as before. You can't protect truth without becoming its prisoner. And beneath it, a smaller note in familiar handwriting. Miles. He's right, you've become exactly what you fought. I sat down, the words blurring for a moment, because part of me feared he wasn't wrong. When you spend your life fighting for truth, you start to forget how to live outside of it. You start to see enemies where there are shadows. You start to guard honesty so fiercely it becomes its own cage. Was that what I'd become? I didn't know. All I knew was that I couldn't let the same corruption that once buried me destroy others. The next morning I handed Eli a drive. Everything on Bington and Miles. Every trace, every code, every relay. He frowned. You sure you want to hand this over? Yes, I said, because the truth can't live inside one person forever. It has to be passed on. He nodded, understanding. What about you? I smiled faintly. Maybe it's time I disappear for a while. A week later, I resigned from the Integrity Initiative. Officially, it was for personal reasons. Unofficially, it was because truth had to outgrow its messenger. The last time I saw Nora, she hugged me tight. You saved a lot of people, she said, even the ones who'll never know it. I whispered back, that's the only kind worth saving. I left the Foundation quietly. No ceremony, no headlines, no cameras. Just a duffel bag and a train ticket heading south. As the landscape blurred past the window, I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who stood in a courtroom as her father called her a fraud. I wondered what she'd think of me now. Maybe she'd understand, maybe she'd forgive me, maybe she'd whisper, you did it right. When the train crossed the Potomac, I opened my notebook and wrote a single line. Truth doesn't belong to anyone. It only survives through those willing to carry it in silence. And for the first time, that silence didn't feel like a burden. It felt like peace. Because some stories aren't meant to be told forever. They're meant to teach and then let go. The world would keep spinning. People would keep forgetting. Systems would keep breaking. And somewhere, someone like me would have to stand up again. Another woman, another voice, another silence turned into strength. And when that happened, I hoped she'd remember the same lesson I finally learned. That honor isn't about who remembers your name. It's about who still believes in the truth because you did. Where do you go when the world no longer needs you, but you still need purpose? That question stayed with me long after I left Washington, after the foundation, after the initiative, after I walked away from the life I'd spent years fighting to rebuild. I thought leaving would bring peace. But peace, I was learning, isn't the absence of purpose, it's what fills the space after it. I headed south at first, toward the Carolinas. No destination, no mission file, no clearance code. Just a one-way ticket, a quiet seat, and the hum of a train carrying me somewhere that didn't know my name. I wore plain clothes, kept my head down, no makeup, no medals. Just me, or whatever was left of me. I rented a small cabin near the Blue Ridge foothills. It was the kind of place you could forget the world even existed. Trees thick with whispering leaves, a creek that caught the sunlight just right in the afternoons, and silence so complete it felt alive. For weeks I didn't check my phone, didn't open the news, didn't reach out to anyone. I spent my mornings walking through the forest trails, letting my thoughts untangle at their own pace. Sometimes, when the fog clung to the ground like ghosts, I caught myself listening, half expecting the static buzz of comms or the low hum of military engines. But all I heard was the wind. Maybe this was what freedom sounded like, or maybe it was just another kind of silence. At night, I'd sit on the porch with a single light on, a mug of coffee in hand, and write. Not reports, not mission logs, just words, memories, reflections, fragments of things I'd never been allowed to say. The first page I wrote began with one line. They called me a fraud, but they forgot I was trained to survive under any cover. I didn't know what I was writing for. Maybe someday someone would read it, maybe not. But the act of writing, of letting the truth breathe without the weight of proof, felt like healing. Still, the world has a way of finding you, even when you disappear. One morning there was a knock at the door, not a loud one, cautious, almost respectful. I opened it to find a woman in her mid-twenties, wearing a VA jacket and holding a small folder. She looked nervous, like someone who'd practiced this visit 100 times. Commander Carrington. I hadn't heard that title in months. It sounded foreign now. Not anymore, I said softly, just Elizabeth. She smiled faintly. My name, Aaron Cho. I was part of the Integrity Initiative. I started a new unit, kind of an extension of what you built. I gestured for her to come in. You found me, I said. Wasn't easy, she admitted. We kept the network decentralized just like you designed it, but I thought you should know it's growing. We're protecting over 300 classified veterans now. The government's calling it the Carrington model. I let out a slow breath, staring out at the trees beyond the porch. The Carrington model, my name again. I thought I'd buried it, but apparently it had learned to live without me. She handed me the folder. Inside were photos, men and women in plain clothes, some with prosthetics, some in wheelchairs, all smiling in that quiet, unguarded way that only people who have survived too much can. These are the ones your systems helped clear, she said. Most of them didn't even know why their records were restored, but I figured you should see what your silence built. I flipped through the images slowly, each face a story, each story a victory I'd never claimed. When I looked up, Aaron was watching me. They talk about you, you know, she said. The woman the judge saluted, the one who taught us that dignity doesn't make noise. I smiled faintly. And what do you tell them? That you didn't need to be remembered to make a difference. That one hit deeper than I expected. She left not long after, driving back toward whatever mission waited for her. I stood at the edge of the porch long after her car disappeared, the folder still in my hands. The world had kept going, and maybe that was the point. That night I lit a fire in the old stone pit behind the cabin. The flames flickered warm and slow, throwing gold against the dark. I opened my notebook to the first page and tore it out. The words I'd written months ago, the ones that started everything, curled in the heat until they turned to ash. It wasn't erasure, it was release. The next morning, I hiked up to an overlook where the valley spread out like a sea of mist. I stood there for a long time, the air sharp and clean, the horizon endless. I thought about my father somewhere far away, maybe still watching the sunrise over a different kind of silence. Sometimes I imagined what he'd say if he could see me now. Maybe he'd still call it dishonor to live quietly, without uniform or recognition. Or maybe, after all this time, he'd finally understand that honor doesn't always come with ceremony. A few days later, I drove into town for supplies. The store clerk recognized me not immediately, but enough to make me freeze. "You're her," he said, squinting. "The one from that trial years ago, the soldier the judge saluted." I didn't deny it. "That was a long time ago," I said. He nodded slowly, respectful. "My sister's Navy. She watched that clip every day before deployment, said it reminded her to keep her head up." I smiled quietly, paid for my things, and walked out. The world had moved on, but fragments of the story still lived where they mattered. Not in headlines, not in history books, in people. That night I sat under the stars again, notebook open, pen hovering over the page. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the need to write about the past. I started writing about the future. About the foundation. About the initiative. About the idea that maybe silence isn't the end of truth, maybe it's the beginning of something better. As I wrote, I realized that even though I'd left Washington, I hadn't really left the mission. I just changed the battlefield. The next morning, I received an encrypted message on the old device I'd kept powered off. No sender, just a string of coordinates. For a moment, instinct took over, that old pulse of alertness, the one that says this isn't over. But when I opened the map, I saw the location. Arlington National Cemetery. The coordinates pointed to Section 60. When I arrived, the sky was pale and quiet. Rows of white markers stretched into forever. I followed the coordinates until I found the spot. A new stone, still unweathered. An RAHVSQZ. 1978, 2025. She stood for truth when silence was easier. My throat tightened. She never told me she was sick, never mentioned the treatments, the hospital stays. She just kept working quietly until the end. Someone had left flowers beside her grave, white lilies and a folded note. I picked it up. She said you taught her that courage can whisper. I knelt beside the stone and let the silence wrap around us both. For a long time I said nothing. Then finally I whispered, "You did more than whisper, Nora. You made the silence proud." The wind stirred the grass. Somewhere in the distance a bugle played taps. On the walk back to my car, I passed a group of cadets visiting the memorial. One of them, a young woman with sharp eyes and a steady walk, saluted as I passed. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. When I returned to the cabin, I hung Nora's photo beside my grandfather's letter. The wall was becoming a collection of souls who taught me that truth doesn't fade, it transforms. For weeks after that, I wrote non-stop. Pages upon pages of reflections about the mission, the silence, the ghosts, not as confession but as preservation, a record for whoever might come next. Because someone always does. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, I walked to the creek and watched the water move. I'd spent my whole life chasing stillness, thinking it was the opposite of motion. But watching the current twist and shimmer, I realized stillness isn't about stopping. It's about flowing quietly with purpose, without resistance. That's what truth does. That's what I had become. When night fell, I closed my notebook for the last time. I didn't need to write anymore. The story was already living somewhere out there, in Aaron's program, in the veterans we'd saved, in the hands of those who now carried the silence forward. I looked up at the stars, the same way I used to look at radar lights on black nights overseas, and whispered, "You did it, Carrington. You finally made the noise stop." And for the first time in forever, I slept without dreaming. Because the war was over. And this time so was the silence. What remains when the war ends? The silence settles, and even truth no longer needs defending. That question found me one morning as I stood at the edge of the valley, the mist curling low through the trees. The air smelled of rain and earth, clean, honest, untouched by ambition. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about what I'd become. The world I'd left behind had changed. I'd seen it in the faces of those Aaron showed me, the soldiers, the analysts, the quiet survivors who'd found their names again. I'd seen it in the folded letters, the salutes from strangers, the programs that carried my designs long after I stopped leading them. The truth had learned to walk without me, and maybe that was the truest kind of victory. But closure, I've learned, isn't a single moment. It's a series of smaller ones, quiet recognitions that tell you the battle is finally done. Mine came on a Tuesday. The mail truck rattled down the gravel road, the same as it always did, but this time the driver waved. "Got something special for you, ma'am," he said. "Came through official channels." I took the envelope, thick, government-issued paper, embossed with the Department of Defense seal. For a heartbeat, I felt the old tension in my chest, that familiar tightening of what-ifs. But this wasn't a summons or an accusation or another battle in disguise. Inside was a single sheet of paper. To Commander Elizabeth Carrington, in recognition of distinguished service and sacrifice beyond duty, the Department of Defense hereby reinstates full honors and classification clearance, effective immediately. Thank you for your silence, your integrity, and your truth. Below that, one line handwritten in blue ink. I knew the handwriting. Honor isn't loud, it's patient. You taught us that. H. Ellsworth. I stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at the page. My first instinct was to file it away with the rest, another artifact of a life I no longer lived. But something in me hesitated. I walked down to the creek, the same one that had become my companion in solitude, and held the letter over the water. The paper rippled in my hands, reflecting sunlight through its folds. Then I let it go. It floated downstream, slow, graceful, until it vanished around the bend. Some truths belong to history, others belong to the river. That afternoon, I cleaned the small cabin, dusted the shelves, packed away the notebooks, folded the uniform I'd kept tucked in the closet. It still carried the faint scent of salt and jet fuel, of rain on steel decks, of a life spent between orders and consequence. I didn't plan to wear it again, but I also couldn't throw it away. Some ghosts deserve a home. As the sun fell, I walked the old trail one last time, up to the ridge where the valley opened wide and endless. I could see the world laid out below me, quiet towns, thin roads, threads of smoke rising from fireplaces. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost undeserved. I thought about all the battles that had brought me here, the courtroom, the betrayal, the verdict, the forgiveness. The father who broke me to protect his pride, the brother who followed his shadow, the friend who gave her life for truth, the strangers who kept the story alive long after I stopped telling it. All of them pieces of the same lesson, that the loudest kind of strength is the one that doesn't need to be seen. A small wind moved through the trees, and for a moment I swore I could hear them, not voices exactly, but echoes. My grandfather's calm steadiness, Nora's warmth, Ellsworth's conviction, even my father's regret, carried on the same breeze that used to whip through the corridors of bases and war zones. I smiled. "You can rest now," I whispered. "We all can." On the walk back down, I saw a girl, maybe 12 or 13, sitting on a rock near the path, sketching something in a notebook. She looked up, startled. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't think anyone came up here." "It's all right," I told her. "Beautiful view, isn't it?" She nodded, clutching her notebook like a secret. "I like to draw the clouds. They change, but they always come back." I smiled at that. "They do," I said, "no matter what the storm does to them." She grinned and went back to sketching. As I passed, I caught a glimpse of her drawing the sky, the ridge, and in the corner, a small figure standing at the edge, hair blown by wind. Me. I didn't correct her. Some moments deserve to remain unspoken. Back at the cabin, twilight had settled over everything soft, amber, forgiving. I lit a single lamp and sat at my desk. The Navy Cross gleamed faintly beside my grandfather's letter and Nora's photograph. For years, I'd treated them like relics. Now, they felt like companions. I opened one of my last blank pages and wrote slowly. I used to believe truth needed witnesses, but truth only needs time. It always surfaces patient, steady, unshaken. The pen hovered for a moment, then continued. They called me a fraud. They tried to erase my name, my record, my worth. But what they didn't understand was that I never fought for recognition. I fought for the silence between lies, the space where honor still breathes. If anyone ever reads this, know that dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't argue or demand belief. It waits. It acts. And when the world finally grows quiet enough, it's still there, unbroken. I set down the pen and closed the notebook. Outside, the sky had gone deep indigo. The stars blinked awake, one by one small lights in an infinite dark. I stepped outside, the cool air brushing my face. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint sound of a train, maybe the same line I'd arrived on months ago, carrying other travelers to other unfinished stories. For a moment, I imagined someone sitting in that train car years from now, reading about a woman named Carrington, the one who stood before a judge while her father called her a fraud, the one who chose silence over spectacle, the one who found peace not by being heard but by being right. Maybe they'd wonder what became of her. Maybe they'd never know. And that was all right. Because legacy isn't about memory. It's about impact. And impact doesn't need applause. It just needs to echo quietly in the right places, in a courtroom, in a foundation, in a letter, in a single act of courage passed from one heart to another. I turned off the lamp, the light fading until the cabin was swallowed by darkness. Only the stars remained, the same ones I used to track during midnight flights, the same ones that watched over me when I stood accused and silent. I whispered to them, to the world, to whatever comes next. You called me a fraud, but the truth never begged to be believed. It just waited to be seen. The wind picked up, soft and steady, moving through the trees like a quiet applause. And in that moment, I understood what my grandfather had meant all those years ago. The line he'd written in that letter I'd carried through every battle, every silence, every heartbreak. Honor isn't loud, it's patient. It had taken me a lifetime to understand. But now, standing there beneath the open sky, I finally did. Because honor doesn't demand attention. It doesn't chase validation. It stands quietly, unwavering, even when no one salutes it. Even when the world forgets. Even when the war is long over, and the last echo of its story fades into peace. It just stands,